Okay, guys. I know you missed me. Uh, Wanted to go ahead and give y'all a hello. We're going to go ahead and get started on our unit called Night. This is a nonfiction unit. We're going to be reading this book next week. Hopefully, I'll be back. I know y'all are missing me. Calm down. Don't be weird. But I do want to go at least give you an intro on this and a little bit of background. I love reading this story. It is a short story. The book that we're going to have, it looks a little bit longer, but it's actually only 77 pages. And it is a nonfiction story, and it's called a memoir because that is only a short period of time in somebody's life. It's written by this man named Elie Wiesel. The W makes a V sound, and the S makes a Z sound. So Elie Wiesel, and it's about his experience during the Holocaust. So, if I can hit the buttons correctly, to give us a little bit of a background, you are talking about the 1930s and 1940s, and most of this book takes place in the 1940s. Um, this time period, all this book is going to take place over in Europe. There was the rise of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler and his regime. During this time, we saw a lot of what we would call anti Semitism. Anti means against. We're going to spend more time looking at your prefixes, roots, and suffixes that y'all glued in later. But anti means against, and Semitism specifically is talking about Semite, meaning of the Jewish faith. So, an anti Semitic person would be somebody who is against anything Jews. The very simple way to put it is hatred of Jews. They during the 1930s, back it up a little bit. In the First World War, Hitler was actually a soldier in Germany, and of course, Germany lost World War One, and Germany was forced to pay war reparations. Reparations means like they had to pay back. So they had to pay all these countries all this money, and they said, "Hey, you started this fight. You get to pay for all the damage." So think billions and billions of dollars that this one country is having to pay, and the German people were pretty upset because not everybody, was involved in the war, but they were. I mean, not only had their country been bombed, but now they're having to pay back any money they might have to fix it, which is going to other countries. And so a lot of people began to resent the rest of the world, especially the U.S., who had come in at the end of World War One, and they began to resent a lot of the Americans. But one soldier in particular rose to power really quickly, and that was, of course, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, which is interesting because he himself had Jewish ancestry, like his mother was Jewish. He blamed a lot of the Jewish community because of his failure in art school. And honestly, when things go wrong, like we all do, we want to blame somebody. Um, and so Adolf Hitler began to push forth this idea through his very powerful speaking skills of the Aryan race. And the Aryan race is the perfect race, this German blood, blonde hair, blue eyed. So if you look around the classroom, there's not going to be very many people that fit this description. And blonde hair, blue eyed, you could have green eyes, you could have brown hair, but like the blonde hair, blue eyed was the perfect race. So he believed that anybody else that was mixed race would have been dirty, essentially. And I don't mean like black and white mix. I mean like you didn't have full German ancestry. So like my family's last name is Huff, and then my dad's family's last name is Smith, and it used to be Kropaniki. So my family is Polish and German. So my family would be mixed blood, and so they would consider us to be dirty. But because I had German ancestry, I might have been allowed to live. So anybody else, if you think of it that way, not doing so hot. To kind of give you an idea, this is not a new thing. The Jews had always been persecuted against for hundreds of years. They've been driven out of every European country. This is going on today. We're seeing this happening in the Middle East today. Like the Jewish people and Islamic people are fighting over whose land is who it belongs to. I mean, but you're talking 1275, Jewish people were made to wear a scar. 1287, they were hung in the streets of London, and they were blamed after the war a lot of because they were successful when it came to money and not falling into a depression that most of Europe fell into, and they were a scapegoat. And when you say somebody's a scapegoat, really what you're talking about is the idea that it's somebody to blame. So from 1939 and 1945, which is the time that we consider World War II, 6 million Jews were murdered, along with hundreds of thousands of others like gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses, the disabled and mentally ill. This is an example of a mass grave that was found at the end of World War II. The Allied soldiers, the Allied forces, the good guys, quote unquote good guys, they discovered all these camps and all these mass graves where they had just murdered all these people. And they weren't murdered because they were attacking people. They weren't murdered because they were, doing anything wrong. They were murdered because they existed and somebody found them offensive. If you look at these numbers, they're really interesting. You can see that the number, it says at the top, percentage of Jews that were killed in each country. So France only had 22%, like versus Lithuania and Greece at 85 and 87. Germany, that's where Hitler took over. I mean, that's where he originated his origin from. He's actually from Austria, but 36%, France 22%. And if you look at Poland, 91% of all Jews that were originally from Poland were killed. I mean, these numbers are huge. And if you look, these countries like Austria, Belgium, these are much lower numbers. And a lot of it, there's an expression like you don't crap where you eat kind of a thing, which is very vulgar, but if you're trying to take over something, you don't want everybody to see the bad things you're doing. So you're going to do a lot of the bad things far, far away. Excuse me. This is the different concentration and death camps that are used by the Nazis. The difference between the concentration and death camp is exactly like it says. You would die in either of these camps. The idea was to work you to death. But if you were sent to the death camp, your chance of survival was much, much lower. If you were sent to the concentration camps, a lot of these, if you notice, were in around major cities. Like this camp right here, this one is Dachau, and this one is right outside the city of Munich, really big city in Germany, versus you have way over here in Poland, and these are smaller cities. They're kind of off on the countryside. And if you notice, all of these are the death camps. These are, of course, the ones that were more concentration camp. This one's right on the border between France and Germany, Natzweiler. And this one is one of the only ones that's outside. It's over here in Belgium, in the Netherlands. This is the Camp Vught. All of these, Treblinka was known as the deadliest camp. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest of the camps. We're going to see quite a few of these when we read the story. I've actually visited the camp of Dachau several years ago. Some students went on an EF tour. I was one of the chaperones on that trip. We toured Germany, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and France. And we went to all these countries, and we actually got to take a tour during the day of Camp Dachau. And the camp still exists. They are still there. Most of the buildings have been torn down, but the structure of the camp is still there. So you can walk the grounds. It's very unnerving. When we get some of the pictures, I'll talk to you a little bit more about those. This one in particular is a picture of Auschwitz. And at the top of it, this thing, it says, work is liberty. This little phrase right here, which is, of course, like a huge lie, because the idea was that you would get there and you could work yourself to freedom. And, of course, most people in this camp died. If you look, this is what Auschwitz looks like today at the bottom picture. If you notice what's leading everybody into it, the most common way for them to get these prisoners to these camps was to use train tracks. And they would load them up and they would call them cattle cars. A lot of times what they were, there was cattle cars. So like think of the trains that we see where all the cows and stuff are cows and other animals are stuffed into the train cars, or like when we see them on 18-wheelers, that's how it would look. But they would put 50, 60 to 100 people in these train cars and cram them in there. And then they would bring them into the camp, and most of these people would never leave again. The most common people that were looked for to be killed during these camps were children. So if you went to a camp and you were an able-bodied person, so if you think about it, like you didn't have any physical handicaps, nothing that was going to stop you from being able to work for 16, 17 hours a day, you were probably going to live. But if you were a young child, or you were pregnant or sick, or sickly, maybe you have like a disease, maybe you have like you get sick often. Like my oldest has allergies, stuff like that. Anything that might have prevented you from being productive, they were going to go after you. And they really went after the children. And the reason why you go after the kids is because To attack the children is to attack the parents, because to kill the next generation, shut everybody up. And if you threaten a child, most parents are going to be compliant. And that was the thing. So if you look, this is just pictures that were taken and some that were just, found afterwards. Like the top picture just shows a group of children that were on a vacation. They're from a French children's home, meaning like they were orphans prior to the war and during the war, and they were sent to a concentration camp, and only one of these 16 in that picture survived. The one at the bottom, been found at a concentration camp, and of course they had to be kept in the camps because they were unable to let them go home. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. There's nowhere for them to go, number one, and then number two, they had been so malnourished, given so little food, so few options, and if you fed them, they would die, and so they had to keep them locked in these camps, even at the end, even after they were freed. Um, Well, then let's go back here. One of the most common questions that I always get on this is, how do you convince people to let them take you here? It was easy. And they're going to see it in the book. I mean, and I hate to say it was easy, but it's one of those. If I convince you that something is for your own good, you're going to do it. And if I keep convincing you that it's for your own good, and if I tell you that or you hear that the worst possible thing could happen, nobody believes it's ever going to happen to them. Nobody believes that they're the ones that's going to get hurt. Nobody ever believes that they're the ones that are going to die. And you don't believe that people could be that evil. I mean, that's how. Or if I tell you, hey, you have to move in this neighborhood, and it's so we can make sure you're protected, or we're moving you because this group is coming in and they're going to borrow your home, or they're going to do this. And you might complain and say, I don't think so. But, if I have guns and I threaten your kids, you might be more compliant. And not everybody was. Some fought back, some died. But the question is, how do you kill 6 million people and do it efficiently? That sounds horrible, but they used to, in the beginning, they were shooting them, and they realized, okay, we're fighting a war against all these allied forces, Britain, the United States, eventually Russia, France. How do I need to save my bullets, basically. And so they came up with this idea of this Zyklon B poison gas. And what they would do is and the picture on the left is, of course, canisters of the gas that was left over at the Majandek death camp. And the picture on the right is a bunch of prisoners that were taken right before they were put into the death chambers, which I'm going to show you in just a second. So what they would do is they would push all these prisoners into this room. And if you look, this is a room, and you can see it right here. It's about the size of, like, this one in particular. So think of it as the size of like half of the A-wing hallway. That is not very big. But I don't care if you can't breathe or you get smothered or crushed to death, because the whole point is to send you in this room and kill you. All right. So the thing at the top is like a light bulb. It's not what you think it is. And sometimes the things at the top were, like sprinkler systems, and it would pour out the gas. But a lot of times they were over on the walls, and they would drop them in the same way that you drop like money into like, if you ever go to the bank and you've been through the drive-through and you see how they take the canister and it drops down, your parents or people put their money in the thing and they send it back up. Well, that's exactly what it was. It would have like a little canister on the side, and they would drop the pellet in there, shut the canister into the wall, and then all of a sudden, bam, the room is filled with gas. When we went to the Dachau death camps, my students had read Night by the time we went. We went around spring break, and so we had just read Night right beforehand. And when we read it, the kids were like, oh my gosh, because that camp is in the book. It's real life, y'all. We walked in a place that we have read the stories of what happened there. And we got into these rooms where, the first room, you make everybody take off all your clothes, because they weren't going to let you go to your death with any kind of dignity. They would make them take all their clothes off because they would save it for the next group of prisoners. And then we got to the room where this particular room is, the gas chamber. We had trouble walking through this room, not because it was like the room was hard to get into, but the room was wide open. You could walk directly into it. It freaked everybody out. It's scary to know that thousands of people, this was the last place they ever walked. This is the last room that they were ever in. And so it's really kind of unnerving. But afterwards, at first they were burying the bodies and they realized, well, I'm just leaving around a bunch of evidence. And so they decided to start burning them. They created these really elaborate ovens. If you've ever seen like a pizza oven, and I know that's morbid to say, but that's exactly what it looked like. If you've ever seen a pizza oven, that's what it was. They would take these and anywhere between 3 and 6 of them. They started off with 1 or 2, and then they basically invented the idea of indoor heating because they found a way to pump in extra heat. They would light the fires. So the thing in the background is the oven, and then the little entryways where they would slide them in. Yes, that is a body being slid in. Oftentimes, the people that were the ones working the ovens were called the Sonderkommando. They were Jews. They were Jews on their own, and they had to work. And the idea was, you were well enough to work, then you could do this. They would go in and take out the gold fillings from people's teeth or their gold teeth, like caps and crowns. They would have to shave the hair, especially of women, because they would use it to make yarn. They would take off any jewelry that might have still been hidden, anything that was still something that could be used. And a lot of times they were the ones who were chosen to feed the dead into the crematorium. And sometimes people they would put in there weren't even dead. And sometimes it was people that they knew. Like you could have, like, say, the younger guy that's standing right here looking into the camera. If you notice, the one on the right is wearing the pajamas, as we've kind of come to know them as the black and white striped pajamas. If you've ever read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, you've seen the movie. Um, that's, I mean, you can tell they all have on a form of the stripes, but they're prisoners. And that could have been a person that he knew. In the book, one of the figures that Ellie meets is somebody who had to put his own dad into the oven. Like I said, it's a process, and you can see that it's a lot of people. These are bodies that are waiting to be processed. The smoke off in the background, you can see, and if you look up here in the front, these, like, that is the center, and then in the back where you can see all the smoke coming from, that's the Hadamar Killing Center, but in the front is a church. So one of the biggest things that happened at the end of all of these, at the end of the war, were people, especially the American soldiers, they came in and they declared martial law. They made a lot of the citizens of Germany and the towns that they were in come in and help bury the bodies and kind of clean up the vestiges of this war. And the soldiers were so angry, and the people in the cities were like, "Well, we didn't know, we didn't know, we didn't know." And there's an episode of Band of Brothers, which is based on the 101st Airborne. Excuse me again. There's an episode where they run into a bakery to go get food and bread and stuff so they can demand that these prisoners be fed. And the baker is yelling at the soldier like, "Well, don't be taking my food. Don't be taking my food." And essentially the American soldier gets in his face and he's like, "Yeah, because you're just a Nazi. Don't you know what you did?" And he's like, "I'm not a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi." And he's like, "You're telling me you couldn't smell it?" I mean, I know y'all can smell it when somebody's grilling outside. Somebody's grilling 5 or 6 hamburgers and cooking with charcoal. And you can smell it a block or 2 away. Somebody's burning leaves in their yard. You can smell it, at the beginning of the neighborhood. So you're talking about burning bodies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no way you didn't smell it. Again, mass executions are really common in the beginning. And if you notice in this picture, it's older. Most people were stripped down to absolutely nothing. This is how some people did escape. They would fake their death, or they would be injured, and they would hide underneath the people that had died as a way to escape. That's how we got some of the not images, but definitely some of the stories. And in Night, we're going to actually meet a figure in his life that tries to warn everybody that this is about to happen. Like, y'all, this is real. This is actually happening, because a lot of people did not believe that the Nazis were as bad as people were saying they were. They're like, "No, there's no way. There's no way people could be that evil." And the people that had the stories to tell, they just sounded so far-fetched. And there's going to be a figure in Ellie's life that tries to warn them and tries to say, "Get out while you can." Again, like I said, they didn't just target adults. They also targeted children, specifically children. The idea being that, again, you kill off one generation, that's another generation that can't fight you. And you also target children, and the parents tend to get in line. They did not target just the poor. It was the wealthy and everybody else too, because they wanted their money. They wanted their money. So this is one event where 33,000 Jews were attacked and killed. A lot of the Jewish families never recovered from this because their homes were confiscated, their art, all kinds of stuff went missing during World War II. Um, and like I said, and it wasn't just killing them. It wasn't just we couldn't just kill them. We couldn't. They couldn't just have themselves. We couldn't just kill and let it be done. No, of course it had to be like let's take their dignity too. It was awful. So like in the top corner, you see bales of hair. The women were shaved in Auschwitz. This was found later on. So they would shave the women's hair and use that to make yarn, to use that to make really cheap clothing, and other supplies. Because again, you're in the middle of a war and the supplies were short anyway. But they would shave the women's hair and keep it. And then the bottom picture is a picture of wedding rings taken from victims at Buchenwald. And if you look at that, that's one soldier holding two hands up, and you can't even see the bottom of the bin because there are so many rings. If you look at like a typical wedding ring, they're not very big. You don't typically, you can't see them from really far off, but you can see how many there are. Again, like I said, they started digging up the bodies once they realized, like, maybe we shouldn't leave around all this evidence that we're killing all these people. And so that's when they began the crematoriums and burning them. There were a lot of different ways. Like I said, it used to be mass executions with guns. They would pump. And then the first gassings, where they would actually take the Nazis or the Nazis would take the Jews, put them into the back of essentially like 18-wheelers or big giant work trucks. And they would take the hose, like a garden hose, and then put it into the exhaust of the vehicle and then pump it into the truck, killing everybody. It was very slow and it was not very efficient for the Germans. So that's when they developed the idea of the Zyklon B poison. Now, the protagonist, and again, it's not a protagonist in the sense of it being a fake person. Elie Wiesel is a real person. He was a real person. He just died here in the last 10 years. He was, you're going to see several pictures of him. But he is our narrator of our story. This is his story. He was born and raised in Romania, and you can kind of see where the map is, the difference between Romania and Germany. Europe is very small. It's about a quarter of the size of the United States. And it is, if you can tell, it is not anywhere near where the war was happening. So he was born and raised in Romania. And so he, of course, in the beginning talks about how, like most people, they never believed the war would come to touch them because of how far away they were, how like it was just, out of sight, out of mind. It's kind of like people talk about, oh, the drought in California. You're like, you don't worry about it because we get, 20 feet of rain every summer or every winter. But until it doesn't scare you until it actually affects you. The original story after he got out of the war was he waited 10 years until he finally wrote the book and tried to publish it. And the original title was And the World Has Remained Silent. He wound up changing the title, and it's actually got 3 parts to this book, but the part that we read is called Night. He changed it because this part of the story is just one section of what happened in his life. But after the war, a lot of Jews tried to come home. And like anybody, when something bad happens, when something bad happens to you, you go and you find your people. You find the people you talk to and you want to tell them, like, hey, this is what happened. Well, this is him trying to tell him, and people didn't want to listen. We get to the point where sometimes people are telling a story and we're like, oh, okay, that's too much. Like if you're telling me something gross, like I don't want to hear about you throwing up, and I don't want you start talking about things being gross and like you get a scab and it's got pus in it. Ugh, no, thank you. I don't want to hear it. And so he was angry, like a lot of other Jews that survived. He was angry that he couldn't talk about it. People wouldn't listen. And so the book was titled And the World Has Remained Silent because of how mad he was. That is actually a picture of him right there. The younger man that's kind of leaned up, if you see it. This is was so during the story, we're going to see that he has 2 older sisters. Him and 2 sisters are the only ones to survive. His father, mother, and little sister all die in the Holocaust. And so this picture was taken on April 16th, 1945, 5 days after the liberation of the camps. I want you to look at how they're sleeping. This is their bunk beds. So we think of a bunk bed, we think of them everybody laying long ways, and you think one person to a bed, maybe 2, if you're like having a sleepover. This was essentially, they were stacked. And if you look, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of people. There was no pillows, no blankets. And if there were, it was mostly hay a lot of times, or straw. And if there was a pillow and a blanket, it was often fought over, and it was so threadbare and full of lice and bugs, you didn't want it. But if you look, this is 5 days after the camp was liberated, which means freed. Look how many people there still are. This is after they pulled out the dead bodies. And yes, they had to stay at the camp. Look how small they are. They couldn't leave because they hadn't eaten in so long and had so little food and nutrition that to let them leave, they probably would have died because of poisoning, water poisoning, food poisoning. Their body had gone so long without food that they were literally going to get sick and die if they ate it or drank too much. Like even more than a few tiny sips of water could have killed them. So this is a picture, and that's actually him in that photo. This is a picture of Auschwitz. Again, it's the largest. You can see these are all of the ovens that are working, the killing centers. And it looks kind of crazy, but this is like the opening of the camp. Like they would bring you in and they would sort you into different rooms and groups. That's also a train right here where they had just come off of. So you can see the different areas. Like, so this is them coming out. It's graphic. I mean, it's a lot. You cannot tell if they're a man or a woman. Their bodies are so emaciated. And like I said, this was afterwards. A lot of the pictures were taken by the people that found the camps and freed them. In the book, we're also going to, Elie Wiesel managed to not only survive more than one concentration camp and more than one killing camp, death camp, but he also encountered the angel of death, Dr. Joseph Mengele. This guy was known as, he was a terrorist. There's no other way. He was one of Adolf Hitler's most trusted officers, and he wanted to experiment on the Jews. He was fascinated with like this idea of the human body. But what he would do is, and he was also fascinated with twins and the mentally ill. He would oftentimes find the weakest ones in camp and use them and operate on them. He was obsessed with the idea of twins. He would put them in different rooms and operate on the different so I'm going to cut the twin A's arm off to see if twin B can feel it in the other room. I would cut their legs off and switch them to see how well they could use each leg now that they had done it. Could one twin control their leg if it was only, this guy was crazy. There's no way to describe crazy other than to say they're crazy. But he encounters him in the book and, survives, and not many who did were able to. Again, a really great show that does a wonderful job of depicting the imagery of this. And sometimes we watch it, so we may watch this at the end. We'll have to kind of see. But this is Second Lieutenant Dick Winters, and this is at the camp of Dachau, the one that my students and I visited. And it said, like, once he and his men found 101st Airborne, they found a camp. They didn't know it was there. They found it, brought it back to their division leaders, and we're like, what do we do? And they tried to like liberate them. And that's when they, discovered they couldn't let them go home or they might die. And there was no home for these people to go to. They had nowhere to go. So they had to do the awful thing and lock them back in these camps. And this is what he wrote in his report at the end. And it was the memory of starved, dazed men who dropped their eyes and heads when we looked at them through the chain link fence. In the same manner that a beaten, mistreated dog would cringe, leaves feelings that cannot be described and will never be forgotten. The impact of seeing those people behind that fence left me saying only to myself, now I know why I'm here. And then another similar situation at Buchenwald. He said, I looked at the bottom bunk and I saw a man. He was too weak to get up and he could just barely turn his head. He was skin and bones and he looked like a skeleton, and his eyes were deep set. He didn't utter a sound. He just looked at me with those eyes, and they still haunt me today. The imagery behind World War II and the concentration camps and the Holocaust is astounding. So this is something we're going to go over very quickly. So reset your brains. We are looking for themes. Even though this is not fiction, there are still some messages in the story. So one of the things you're going to add into your notebook that we're going to be looking for, and we're going to do while we read, you don't have to do it right now, is the idea of night. The book is called Night. So we're going to pay attention to what happens at night and what that might symbolize. So why would these things happen at night? And why would he choose to call the book Night? Why would he only write about these things in particular that are only going to happen at night? To bear witness. This is the one that's hardest to do. But you are to pay attention to which characters. And I'm calling them characters because